What a spectacular audience and what an amazing setting to be marking the 25th edition of ET Awards. Thank you all for being with us here today. And most of all, thank you, ma'am, for joining us this evening. Your budget this year, ma'am, created a lot of positivity, as Cyrus also said, with the tax cuts, with the continued support for CapEx, and staying the course with the fiscal consolidation. But as we meet now, we are focused on a lot of geoeconomic uncertainty. There is a raging tariff war, which no one is able to predict what course it's going to take. What is going to be India's game plan? How should we negotiate this, and how are we going to negotiate with the US?
I didn't think you'll ask me the first one to be about the negotiations which are going on. And in all fairness, I think I would leave it for Piyush to determine how he's going to take the whole negotiation. He and his team are at it, even as we speak. Well, in a broad sense, I think both sides should have ambition for a good treaty. And nobody can fault that. Particularly for India, when you're looking at Vikasit Bharat, you need to have a good traction. Everybody is concerned about the growth numbers. You want it to be not in single digit, you want the growth to be in double digit and all that. You still need to do a lot more to strengthen our exports. And in order to strengthen our exports, not in this sector, not in that sector, across the board, wherever export potential lies, we need to strengthen that. So I'm sure the Commerce Minister is quite seized of this, and he would take this agreement to meet the ambitions that we have in terms of promoting growth, in terms of ensuring that our supply chains are intact and smooth and flowing well, and therefore that would guide his negotiations, I would think.
But so geoeconomic fragmentation is now a reality. In some ways, it's a reversal of the forces of globalization that have created a lot of prosperity in this century. Do you think this will impede India's growth momentum?
I see for every challenge that exists in these kind of fragmentation or tariff war or some economies reaching a deflationary level, lack of demand overseas, I see in each one of them an opportunity. And I would thank that kind of a tendency growing in us who are all in the cabinet. I'm sure Ashwini ji will vouch for what I'm saying. That kind of a tendency being built into us or being allowed to grow within us is something which we draw from the PM. He says wherever there is a challenge, you forget there is an opportunity, not just one, maybe a couple of opportunities in them. So I would think whether it is geo-fragmentation or supply chain disruption, or tariff wars, or strategic disruption to free flow of trade, or multilateralism now taking a different kind of a multipolar angularities. In each one of them, there is an opportunity for us, and it is for us to very smartly move to make sure that this is the opportunity that India was waiting for, and we should use it so that after all, it is another 22 years before we should reach the goal of a Vikasit Bharat. So I'm sure every Indian is expecting all of us to move in that kind of a speed.
Sorry to stick to trade on one more question. Now, while this sort of, while other countries also face offensive tariff action from the US, there is a very real chance that some of them could try and dump their goods in India. Is that an eventuality we are seriously watching against?
Well, yes, you're already seeing signs of that. Dumping of excess inventory which is sitting with any country, you know largely who we are talking about. When such chances exist, we will have to guard ourselves against it. But how smartly we do that? Sorry, I'm sure some people are keeping account on how many times I'm using smartly, but that's it. We need to be smart about these sort of things. So how carefully we can find our way to avoid the dumping, however much there is a layer of Indian manufacturers, small, medium-sized, who prefer cheaper inputs. But even then, the larger consideration should be to be able to give them the access to cheaper inputs, but not become a victim of dumping. These are the balancing kind of acts that we have to do, and that I'm sure many of you all will agree, but I would still say it here, we do it in consultation with the stakeholders. It's not as if we sit in Delhi, we plan for it, and then we do it irrespective of what the stakeholder wants. And in the stakeholder, they are not one block. Within them, there are sections which prefer complete stoppage of dumped goods, and some sections which prefer a calibrated approach on it. So government's task it is to make sure that we plan for it and balance everybody's interests.
Ma'am, you've spearheaded major reforms in taxation, now in personal tax, but previously also in corporate tax. Is it time now to look at a more comprehensive or rationalization of GST slabs? The IMF has also advocated it.
Well, I think we've started this exercise. In fact, at the time when we started it, I would say it was late 22 when we started this exercise of rationalizing the GST, for the rates, for the number of slabs, and on the other side for compliance and the process itself. So the twin-pronged approach to simplify GST was started late 22, early 23. Some people were saying you're not even allowing to settle for the GST to settle. After all, it was launched in 2017. You're already starting to revamp it. You're not allowing it to reach its normal course to see what is an average earning that you can get out of it per month. And so there was an element of discouragement, but we didn't stop it. There were different groups of ministers who were looking at it. And every time there is a state government election and there is a change of ministers, we revamp the committees. But that work has almost reached a finale. Now, at this stage, there is one more look that I've taken it upon myself. The groups have done excellent work, but I still have taken it upon myself to once more completely review each of the group's works and then probably take it to the council to see if we can come to a final conclusion on, yes, we agree on these, yes, we have changed these, but some more work is required in some other, so we'll take it to the next council and so on. So we are very close to coming to a final call on some of the very critical issues: reduction, rationalization of rates, looking at the number of slabs, and so on.
Is there any possibility you can give us a glimpse into what is in store? Any more than you have said?
I think I was very clear. Reduction in rate. And that is not as though we are now exploitatively high in rates. I've said this number number of times. At the time when the GST was launched, the revenue neutral rate was somewhere 15.8%. Meaning, in simpler terms, any one particular item of GST tax or any item on which GST is levied, if you would levy it at 15% rate, you would still not have increased the rate for the consumer, nor have you lost the revenue which has to come from it. You would get as much revenue, the burden will not be on the consumer. That was 15.8 on an average across the board. Since after the launch of GST until 23, we had already brought that 15.8 to 11.4, which means rates have come down. And 15.8, when it was launched, that average was itself lesser than what it was pre-GST. So let me dispel any doubting Thomases here that the GST has made life costlier after it was introduced. Item by item, I would challenge anyone to tell me if there is any one item for which the GST rate has gone up after the introduction of GST. And therefore, naturally, by inference, if 15.8 has become 11.4, it's only come down even further. So the clue that you want is it will come down even further down.
Fabulous. I think we can all, yes, applaud to this particular rationalization. Ma'am, let's come to the topic of private investment, which we have discussed at the ET Award stage last year as well. Analysts say private investment is happening, but it is somewhat narrowly focused on a few sectors. What would be your expectations for a more broad-based resurgence in private investment?
I said this somewhere else. This question being asked to the government is actually being asked to the wrong entity. If industry wants to invest, or industry is investing, or industry, as you say, is investing only in some sectors and not in others, or it has to broad base, these are all commercial decisions. It is for industry to speak about it. And I'm not asking them to give on your behalf, because I've not asked anything since you're asking this question. I'm not asking them to say why they are or why they are not. But I'd certainly like them to talk about things about investment. After all, if they don't speak out, how is the government to have any clue on how things are moving? And if we don't hear it from the horse's mouth, who else would we rely? Somewhat I will hesitate to rely on media on this. Sruthijith has not caught me.
I'll take half a moment to recover from that. Ma'am, the Prime Minister has spoken about a deregulation commission. You have spoken about it in the budget as well. What is the kind of body we are envisaging? Is it going to be a permanent body? Is it, what is its role going to be?
At the moment, I have not thought about having a permanent body. The initial exercise is to see, for financial sector, you have the FSTC, but for the non-financial regulator, and there are several of them. And between the regulators, many things fall between the stool, and many of the end users or the people who are being regulated do have a difficulty as to who should they approach. This one or that one, and in between they are just left unguided. And this is one of the very benign issues on which interregulatory bodies coordination is necessary. If you're not talking about the benign, and if you're really looking at very many malicious complaints that you get of malicious acts, between regulators, greater coordination can effectively bring down the stress levels and also bring down the number of authorities to which stakeholders will have to approach. So to simplify and to avoid overlaps, you need to have a interdepartmental or interregulatory understanding and drawing of very thin lines. Otherwise, it becomes huge iron curtains which people can't pierce through.
Ma'am, I'll now come to the question that perhaps you might have expected me to ask in the beginning. The stock markets are seeing dizzying volatility. What is your prognosis for the reasons, and how do you see a path towards more calm markets playing out?
It's like asking, will the world be calm? Will the wars come to an end? Will the Red Sea be safer? Will there be no sea pirates? Can I comment on it? Or any one of you all would like to comment?
But surely, there is a lot of commentary. Surely you read in our newspaper as well as others, a lot of questions. Okay, let me come to a specific point in that case. The sell-off by the FIIs, now we've seen some substantial sell-off by the FIIs, perhaps for the last 6 months or so. This has led to now a resurgence in the clamor for a reduction in the long-term capital, in capital gains taxes applicable to them. Do you see any merit in this argument?
As I said, there are some taxation matters on which, particularly the parliament session being on course, budget session that is, there's only an intermission. The session is not sine die shut. And we are resuming on Monday, the most inappropriate time for a finance minister to talk on tax.
All my desperate attempts at headline hunting are going nowhere, as you can see. I won't even try to drag you anymore into this markets question. It's quite clear that you don't wish to deliberate on it. Ma'am, on the matter of public sector banks, many of them do now need capital to support the growing demand for credit. Is the government open to reducing its stake in PSBs below 51%? Will we see some moves now?
Not specific to today's context. That we'll have to reduce and allow retail shareholders participate in public sector banks is a principle agreed to by this government. We will be increasing the public float. We want to have more and more common public, retail investors in banks to be actively buying and selling shares and get into the secondary market and be also, if anything, representing themselves to the boards. That doesn't seem to be welcome, you know.
Ma'am, there has been some concerns expressed that, while chasing returns, shadow banks or NBFCs, their lending towards microcredit hasn't gone too well. What is your view on this, or are these concerns that you share?
There were some concerns at least a year ago, but I think the RBI came in time, gave quite a good guidance. Sometimes people thought that was very tight. I think now again RBI is given some relaxation, and therefore the understanding of the RBI, of the government, and largely of the public is when NBFCs went too far too soon, too probably easily, it did cause concern. Not about every NBFC, but those who are small, who are very adventurous, and therefore the RBI had come in. Now I think there is good correction happening on that, so I'm sure it will settle down.
India is negotiating FTAs with a number of countries, including the EU bloc. What ought to be our guiding principles? What are the compromises we can make, and what are the ones that we can't?
Well, the first principle in that is put India's interest first, and in this I won't shy away from saying some of the bilateral agreements done earlier, even with groups of countries, not just one-on-one bilateral, but India with a group, either the negotiations were very speedily handled. I do not want to attribute any intentional malice or anything. Either the negotiations were very speedily handled, or the language of the document was very loose, or they were hasty understanding of the collateral which we'll face. That today the Commerce Ministry is engaged in review of many of the FTAs already signed, whether it is with Japan, whether it is with Korea, whether it's with ASEAN. There cannot be a second thought in India. No stakeholder will have a different opinion that in some of these agreements, India is facing a challenge. There are goods where you think you're very well concerned about, but because of the FTA, there is just a flood of goods coming in which you're not able to regulate. Duties don't make a difference to them because the FTA allows it. And therefore, the experiences and lessons learned from that kind of agreement signing, today our understanding is a good negotiation, putting India's interest should be absolutely your top priority. And unless you do negotiate for India's own good, even your negotiation will not be taken seriously by the opposite side because they are very clear on what they want. But can you not be as clear? And therefore, I would think the approach now is to be a lot more hands-on on your negotiation. Take the stakeholders absolutely at every process with their inputs, not just consult them once and leave them, but as you progress, get guided by their inputs. And above all, on the larger principle, it is going to be a lot of bilaterals. It is not just India. globally now, because of the tariff uncertainties, because of the ineffectual way in which WTO operates, you are going to depend on bilateral agreements rather than look at multilateral or even look at bilateral, but when things go wrong, you still have a WTO to fall back on? No, you probably don't have an effective WTO. I'm not saying it's not there, it is there. But with your complaints going there, you're not going to get any redressal in a near future. So what is the good of it? And therefore, bilateral, your interests first, and ensure the language of the agreement is such that you don't get into legal tussles too often.
There are a number of multilateral initiatives, such as on climate and BEPS, that India has been a very robust contributor to, from where the US has now withdrawn, and therefore, will India continue to engage despite who else leaves in these multilateral
The
forums?
two-pillar solution, BEPS.
Yes.
I'm not sure if there is any alternative to what existed before for the BEPS negotiations or for the two-pillar solution. With US not participating, and it was US together with OECD and G7, which were taking it up very seriously to talk about the two-pillar solutions. And that was essentially the way in which one concern under the BEPS, base erosion, profit shifting, could be addressed. But if two pillars fallen, other concerns of BEPS remain, and there is no one particular group whose priority will be BEPS now when they are looking at what's going to happen to, let us say, Western Europe's security considerations, or the Indo-Pacific, or the IPEF, or the Quad, or the NATO. There are very many such issues on which the world will be now discussing on priority. There will be a time when they'll come back to it, but at the moment it's not BEPS and two-pillar.
And we are projected to grow at about between 6.5 and 6.7% next year. I think everyone likes a faster GDP growth. What would you say are maybe the 2 or 3 things that need to fall in place for for us to achieve maybe 1 or 2 percentage points more in the growth rate?
See, this is an audience which knows about what are the things which are going to contribute to our growth. So there's no point in me first going in detail about it. But there's one thing on which definitely I'd like to take this opportunity, tell the media, make all of us think about is, like the markets, there is a sentiment which prevails in a country to grow. You need to have that positivity, you need to have that self-belief. And if this is said, the unsaid is, you need to be the last person to run down your own country. You need to believe in India's capacities. It is that sentiment which is missing, if anything, today, so that all of us can trust each other and say, yes, we can do it and move forward. Now, for every one good big thing which happens, there are 100 people who say, oh, it's nothing at all. Oh, come on, we did it during so-and-so's era as Prime Minister, so what you're doing now is no good. No, please. Earlier Prime Ministers would have achieved 100 things. In today's context, if you're achieving something, would you want to go along with it? Or stand against the tide and say, I believe what happened earlier, but I don't believe anything that you do today. Are you living in today, or are you living in 60s and 70s India? We saw what happened in those ages. I'm not denying any achievements of any prime ministers of the day. But today, with the given challenges, and with the kind of sustained growth that we are showing, and not just Indians saying it, you may question MOSPI's data, you may question anything. But every agency outside says India is the fastest growing country. All right, not 12%, at least 6.5, at least 7. And when I say at least, it's not to say I want some concessions in understanding. 6.5 or 7 sustained for the last post-COVID era. Are we serious? And there is not one sector which is also, not growing or which is lagging behind. Periodically, you can always come up automobile sectors in difficulty. They're sitting with inventory. Some other sector. I met with an eminent representative of the automobile sector. Very clearly, we should understand what kind of changes have happened in India over the last, let us say, 7-8 years. We rapidly want to match up with the global standards in emission. Europe, after having achieved a certain level of per capita income, says my level of emission will be this. Very well for them. But we brought in that level of emission standards even when we are still at 2,000 per capita income. Which means on the one hand, we want to move fast. On the other, the more the standard rigor, the more the rigorous standard that you're bringing in, the cost of the vehicle goes up. Many people who are aspiring to own their first vehicle can't buy it because of the emission requirements making the cost of vehicle going up. I'm not saying emission standards should not be followed, but let us understand that jacks up the cost. Now, if car sales are therefore hit, look at India. You can never achieve what China has achieved. Please. For every one global disturbance, which we meet and try to rise above, the disturbance is forgotten. But the rigor with which you're going forward is the question. Oh no, but post-COVID, K-shaped recovery, B-shaped recovery, C-shaped. Ring all the alphabets you want, but we're moving forward, aren't we? So my expectation, other than everything else, banks will have to be robust, credit will have to be available, fuel cost will have to be low, more funds will have to be available for small and medium industries. The rigor with which you want to have ease of doing business should also trickle down to states. Your municipalities and local bodies will have to do well. All that said, sentiment, please. If sentiments can govern our markets and therefore all of us feel buoyed at one point and completely watered down on the other, so is the economy. In spite of the achievements, if we go on naysaying, our youth are not going to hold us easily accountable. They will put us through the grind, saying, what are you all doing? Startups have proven to us in the last 5 years, against all odds, how they can progress and how they've made India the third largest ecosystem. Ashwini spoke about it. If they are able to do that, shouldn't all of us try and do this and make India do faster, grow faster? I would strongly pitch for an optimistic tenor, and not when we are not really growing at all. Fastest growing last 3-4 years continuously. At this time too, we don't want to be optimistic.
The message is loud and clear, and with that we come to the end of this session. A big round of applause to our always wise, always candid Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman ji. Thank you so much, ma'am, for being with us.